Speaking of St. Louis Blues, Alex Pietrangelo. You write about the defenseman. What's happening there?
So Nick had the big scoop on the weekend. It's just a great piece of reporting by Nick that there might be some interest in from Toronto on Alex Pietrangelo, and I think Nick is all around it. I think he's 100. He needs my backing, but he's 100% correct. I think there was something going on there, and with a few more days to work on it, what I believe happened is that St. Louis was talking to Toronto about Nylander, and they brought Pietrangelo's name up. And they said, would you be interested? And I think Toronto would be interested in Pietrangelo as a player. Who wouldn't? But I don't think they were interested. Well, obviously they didn't make the deal, but I don't think they would be interested. From what I understand about the Maple Leafs, they would be interested in him in that particular trade. And the reason is Nylander's 6 years younger.
Yeah.
And secondly, Pietrangelo's 1 year away from an extension. He's eligible on July 1st. And I think they'd be worried that they could sign him under their cap situation. So if you were going to tell me that Toronto wasn't going to do Pietrangelo from Nylander in that deal, I totally believe it. But that doesn't mean, as Nick says, that they wouldn't be willing to do Pietrangelo in another deal. I think they're looking at every defenseman out there. I think they're not looking for guys with a lot of term, or if they have some term, they're not making big money. I could see them saying, okay, we'll take Pietrangelo for 2 playoff runs, and if we can't sign him, we'll move on. But I think Nick was totally around there, and I believe it was part of Nylander talks, and we'll see if they revisit them.
Do you think that, and listen, St. Louis is having a real tough season.
They're in total WTF mode.
Yeah, understood. And so because of that, do you think that it's almost a given that Alex Pietrangelo will soon, maybe not soon, will one day be ex of the St. Louis Blues?
I think you have to prepare in St. Louis for anything can happen. The organization's in shock right now. There's some years you go into a season, Jeff, and you know you're not going to be very good. And there's other years you go into a season and you say, we're going to be really good. And St. Louis thought they were going to be really good, and the reverse has happened. And it takes you a while to come to grips and understand that. That's where the Blues are now. So I think, and I do agree with this, from what I understand, their approach is, let's start seeing what's available on our guys, and then we'll make our decisions. You have to be prepared, if you're a St. Louis Blues fan, that major surgery is coming. And they'll listen on Tarasenko. They'll listen on Pietrangelo. They will listen on just about anyone.
Parayko?
Yes, they would listen on Parayko. That doesn't mean all these guys are getting traded, but I think you have to believe it means that some of those guys are getting traded. And Tarasenko is in the dreaded situation, which is his no trade kicks in July 1st. So St. Louis knows if they want to deal him, they have to do it now, some point before then.
And listen, this is a team that got whipped on the weekend, and you saw Alex Steen, talk about where they're at. You saw, Vlad Tarasenko apologize to St. Louis Blues fans. You have Braden Shen talking about how the team is fragile and in a delicate spot. You have a practice fight between Robert Bertuzzo and Zach Sanford, and the losing continues for the St. Louis Blues. I think you're right about major surgery, but correct me if I'm wrong, true or false, when GMs call, they call for Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou.
They do, but I think they understand that that's not where St. Louis necessarily wants to go. If they're trading those guys, they're getting a young piece with term in return. St. Louis is not doing rentals. St. Louis is not necessarily doing older guys. I would guess, and I don't know this. This is just me speculating by the way I understand that most people in the NHL think. If you're trading a guy like that, you're getting a young player with team control who's very good. But I just think that anything's going on there. And I'll tell you, 2 years ago, too, on Pietrangelo, I don't think there's any way he's going to Toronto. Don't know if he wants that aggravation or that hassle. But right now, John Tavares is there. They've got a long history back to novice hockey. And if it's even possible, there's no doubt he's picking up the phone. He's calling John Tavares, and John Tavares is telling him, I'm here. I love it. It's not that bad. And he's going.
It's great when you win in Toronto.
It's great. Like, this is the thing. And I really believe that this was the mistake Montreal forgot at the end with PK Subban. and this is what Vancouver had such a gift in the Twins. You have to, if you're going to play in that market, you have to be one of two people. The person who can embrace the stage or the person who can ignore the stage. You've got to be one or the other. Tavares can do both. He can both embrace and ignore. PK embraced it. He didn't ignore it because he loved it. So the Sedins embraced and ignored. You have to be willing to do one or both of those things, and you need guys like that.
I want to bounce around a bunch of topics here on this week's edition of 31 Thoughts, the podcast. Philadelphia, as we record this tonight, we'll be doing the Scotiabank Wednesday night hockey game, 9 o'clock Eastern. Calgary Flames facing off against the Philadelphia Flyers. Chuck Fletcher, GM, is on this is on this 5-game road trip that the Flyers are on. Tonight is game 3. What's happening with Wayne Simmons? What's happening with the goalie situation? What's happening with the Flyers, period?
Wayne Simmons, we talked about this on the podcast last week. Ron Hextall didn't want to give him the term.
Yeah.
And whether or not he was being shopped depended on who you talked to. So I think to some teams they were talking, to other teams they weren't. Chuck Fletcher's on this West Coast trip. He's going to sit down with Simmons, just get a chance to know him, talk to him. I think what that's going to mean is a follow-up